A Quality of Mercy closes out Season 1 and chooses to tie into one of the classic tales of the original series, the recently re-looked at Balance of Terror. We start, appropriately for that, at the boundary of the neutral zone. Since this is before even that, no one has ever seen a Romulan and doesn't know that they make a habit of marrying hot alien prisoners. Klingon, human, for those mistrustful of outsiders, it must be that forbidden fruit thing. Pike and his captain girlfriend are having a little something of their own right now, but it's going to have to wait. Right now, they need to address the problem of the remoteness of these outposts. Being way out here along the neutral zone, being at these outposts makes joining the Foreign Legion look like a minor commute. So they'll be getting state-of-the-art matter synthesizers that can use the minerals of the rocks here, along with a bunch of mining craft that can be operated remotely and can be upgraded on a free-to-play model. Well, a kid comes running in, anxious to meet the crew of the Enterprise, except Pike realizes this is one of the kids who will one day be involved in that accident that happens in the future, the one that turns him into the incredible melting Davros. He decides to send Mott, that's the kid, a warning about the accident, prompting a visit from an older Pike dressed in one of the film-era uniforms. After the titles, Pike expresses his skepticism, so he shares his tragic backstory involving his pony with a goofy name having to be put down, and then says that the plan to save the two cadets and himself does work, except it wrecks the future. He's even brought a time crystal to illustrate just how, and so they can crush it up and snort it afterwards. So Pike is shifted into where he will be in the future, and so begins with the wedding of Balance of Terror.
We take you and you both want to get married.
Improv is an underrated skill in time travel. That's interrupted by a red alert, and Spock, Pike's first officer, reports about the attack on the outpost. Pike tries to acclimate himself and learns the attackers are likely the Romulans, but that's just conjecture. So he takes Spock aside and tells him that he's from 7 years into the past, but Spock points out that logic says the more likely answer is Pike's little choo-choo's gone round the bend. So at Pike's prompting, Spock mind melds with him and says that the incident didn't happen. None of the cadets were there to need saving when the reactor malfunctioned.
Thus, you remained captain of the Enterprise, putting you in charge at a crucial moment in the ship's existence.
A moment where the whole future hangs in the balance.
I've got to wonder if that means that Pike was split into his good self and evil self like Kirk was in The Enemy Within. So, something terrible will happen. Yes. Something so awful it compelled the Klingon priest to send you back in time to avert it. Yes. I'm sure it's obvious what needs to happen. Well, very obvious. We must make sure that terrible future doesn't happen. We must make sure that terrible future happens at all costs. Perhaps this calls for another mind meld. Spock defends his reason by saying the trip to the future wasn't to alter it directly. And while he doesn't say it, the reason why is clear after a moment's thought. Wouldn't the Pike who already lived it be better equipped to make the right decisions than a Pike who can't perform a wedding ceremony in this time without screwing it up? This is all to convince Pike not to alter events in the first place and let the original timeline play out. Because if Season 3 Discovery taught us anything, it's that everything will work out just fine in the end for the Federation. So the Farragut, La'an's ship, is only hours away and can come to help. And they'll likely need it, as that poor dope is still on the outpost 7 years later, and now is getting shot at. This guy knocked boots with the wrong admiral's daughter, I'm sure of it. The ship makes its appearance, emerging out of nowhere and destroying the outpost before vanishing again. The Farragut arrives, but to be clear, La'an is not the captain. No, the captain is James T. Kirk. Woo-woo! Spock devises a way to detect them, though, and figures the Romulans are likely flying blind. And while Ortegas is champing at the bit to enter the neutral zone, Pike refuses because it's an act of war. Kirk agrees and suggests shadowing them, move for move, to appear like a sensor reflection. Meanwhile, in this timeline, George is on the ship, and says that while his brother has his cowboy aspects, he's still one of the finest captains in the fleet. Just don't leave him alone with your girlfriend. Well, Spock intercepts that feed, puts it up on the screen, and reveals that Romulans look just like Vulcans. Kirk's opinion is that this was revealed now in order to sow discord, and it works. During the discussion, Spock again suggests that attacking is what is needed here, so that's what they're going to do. And this time, the plan for the Comet is for the Enterprise and the Farragut to use the tails so they can both get weapons lock and catch the Romulans in a pincer move. Only, as we know, the Romulans know of the trap, and prey upon the Farragut because it's the weaker of the two ships. When it's disabled, Kirk calls on Pike to start firing, not just about hitting the Romulans, but drawing their attention away from the helpless Farragut. That works, though the Enterprise gets hit with the plasma weapon. Luckily, it doesn't have the teeth when it travels that far through space, so they can help to evacuate the Farragut before they lose life support. Pike heads down to oversee the evacuation, running into a very different, more comfortable with herself La'an, but with news that Una is locked away and can't talk to anyone. Well, what can round out this day?
Captain Pike, we need to talk now.
Oh, that. Kirk is very unhappy that Pike held back. Pike sees it as his caution versus Kirk's recklessness as the reason one of them has a ship and the other has a floating metal doorstop. Well, Spock says the Romulans are damaged too. They're trying to limp their way back to the neutral zone, only there's not much they can do with phasers down and photon torpedo tubes damaged. Can't even beam over and give them a pink belly. Their blood is green, so it wouldn't work. Pike instead calls over to offer a ceasefire and a chance to talk, to hopefully negotiate a way out of this. They call up and talk to the Romulan commander. What a pity he wasn't played by the guy who plays Spock's dad on Discovery. That would have been fun. Pike gives a speech about how this war was fought 100 years ago, for reasons no one can likely even remember, so perhaps they can try to just put aside the past. Let's not bicker and argue about who massacred who. The Romulan commander agrees to a 2-hour ceasefire for repairing their ships and burying their dead. Only the sub-commander feels this is a mistake. A ceasefire is a sign of weakness and they should exploit it. Repair their weapons and destroy the Enterprise when they're not expecting it. The commander takes him aside, pointing to a campaign where the sub-commander's uncle died. A victory for Romulus, it was said. Stupidity in the commander's view. A retreat would have saved lives and equipment instead of gaining a victory that was disproportionate to what was lost. The attempt to make Romulus stronger in that case actually made them weaker. You don't have to think like a Vulcan to see the logic of that. In private, Pike discusses the dark future with Spock, trying to guess what could lead to that dark future. Farragut and a bunch of outposts, yeah, not great, but it probably takes more than that. And even Una being sentenced to a Federation penal colony is bad, especially for her, but not so that we must avoid this future no matter what the cost. Before they can discuss further, Kirk swings by to say that he wants to work on a backup plan to get some reinforcements. Pike knows that's impossible, but as Kirk notes, yes, Pike knows it's impossible, but the Romulans don't. Still, to make this plan work, it'd take a miracle.
Aye, that's the one. This is where the auto repair was getting hung up. She's pretty fused.
Luckily, we have an expert in that department. Well, the 2-hour ceasefire reaches its end, and Pike calls up to say that, yes, they can fight, but another form of strength is the willingness to take chances on gaining an ally from one who was once an enemy. And it might have worked if the sub-commander hadn't called in, well, everybody. The purpose of the mission was to test the Federation for weakness, and they found it, and now they must exploit it. The commander clearly sees the stupidity and self-destructiveness of this move and has the guy arrested. But right now the Praetor is in command of the situation. She issues an ultimatum, but that's when Kirk's plan comes through. He's brought reinforcements of his own. Reinforcements in the form of a massive bluff. He shows up with a bunch of robotic construction vehicles, knowing the Romulans would have no more idea what a modern Federation ship might look like than they would of Romulans. Hopefully they have no idea what Bobcat is. Pike calls up using Kirk's bluff and pointing out that they have footage of a true act of war, a cloaking Romulan vessel destroying an outpost, something they have recorded. And thus, for shaming them, the Romulan ship and its crew are about to be destroyed.
I regret that we meet in this way. You and I are of a kind. In a different reality, I could have called you friend.
If only we had some time crystals, we could make that reality happen. So the Romulans shoot down their own ship. They seem to make a habit of doing that, don't they? But this isn't the end of it. The Praetor is now following through on the ultimatum.
What do Romulans care of peace? It means nothing to us. And your apparent affinity for it has sealed your fate. Thank you, Captain Pike. If not for your weakness, we would have never known what easy targets your Federation would be.
Glad to help. Well, they need to get the warp engines working, so Kirk sends in the robot ships to buy them some time, sacrificing their existence to save all these lives, and no one in the Federation will ever mistrust robots again. While they manage to get away, a broadcast goes out that there is now war between Romulus and the Federation, and the ship is badly damaged. Pike also learns that Spock is so bad he looks like he's already dead. Even if he were to recover from this, he'd no longer be the same man. This is what Pike has unwittingly done. First, by his hand of friendship, instead inviting a war, and the best man for a lasting peace between the Romulans and the Federation will never be able to work that out. Speak softly, but carry a big stick, Teddy Roosevelt famously said. Sometimes the situation needs diplomacy, but sometimes it requires a soldier. Sometimes the only way to get peace is not an attempt to appeal to the best in someone, but to scare them enough to stay their hand long enough to then build that peace. That is an unpleasant message, but realistically, it's hard to argue that it's wrong. Well, future Pike departs right when Kirk arrives, and Pike can see that, rather than worrying Kirk's approach might start a war, maybe his approach would have prevented one. So Pike returns to his own proper time to allow history to play out as it originally would have. He has a talk with Spock, who puts together the general idea that Pike is choosing to take his own grim future rather than letting it fall to Spock. While it works just fine without it, there is an interesting coloring of the menagerie as a result of this. Both Spock's insistence on helping Pike regardless of the risk to himself, and Pike's attempt to convince Spock not to endanger himself like this. Again, it was fine originally, but the idea that Pike knows how important Spock is, and Spock, knowing Pike, chose this fate to protect himself, has an interesting shade to it. But hey, at least everything is worked out in the here and now.
Under Starfleet Code of Conduct 587.63, I am arresting Commander Una Chin Riley for violations of our anti-genetic modification directive.
The title of this episode is likely taken from a speech in The Merchant of Venice. But what is interesting to me is that while the quote is the quality of mercy, this is a quality of mercy. I find that interesting because that's the name of an episode of The Twilight Zone, about an American soldier forced to witness a situation from the point of view of his enemy, but while coincidentally featuring none other than Leonard Nimoy. I don't think this is meant as an homage to that in any way, and in truth the episode is fine as a reconsideration of Balance of Terror. It has its cake and eats it too. A reimagining, but with the twist things take a turn for the worse. It sees things remade with modern technology and storytelling styles, yet also by its very nature states, as things were originally, they were better. It's the perfect cap to Season 1, because it delivers what made Strange New Worlds a success. Something for those without history with the show, but while also playing to the audience of longtime fans. You don't have to watch Balance of Terror to get this, but familiarity with it can enhance the experience. And giving Kirk a chance to demonstrate his capacity to think on his feet and come up with a brilliant plan was very respectful to the character. It does feel exactly like something Kirk would do. A great finish to the first season.